Good morning, all of you. We have reached the third day of the Living Dystopian International Conference that is being held at the Osmania University Center for International Programs in Hyderabad. On behalf of Inspirare Arts Foundation and Osmania University Center for International Programs, I extend a very warm welcome to Professor Douglas Lanier, our plenary speaker for the day. I have the immense pleasure and honor to introduce Professor Douglas Lanier to all of you. I met Professor Douglas Lanier in 2008 for the first time at the Adaptation Studies Conference in Amsterdam. Since then, he has inspired me immensely to work on Shakespearean film criticism. I remain indebted to Professor Douglas Lanier for his help and cooperation always. We have had all kinds of exchanges over the years, and he has been a source of delight and inspiration for me. Thank you, Professor Douglas Lanier. Professor Douglas Lanier is teaching in the Department of English at the University of New Hampshire. After completing a double major in English and Humanities at Stetson University, he did his graduate work at Duke University, where he was trained as a medieval and early modern drama specialist. He has taught at Duke, UCLA, Allegheny College, and Gonville College, and Caius College in Cambridge, the University of Milan, UNED, and University de Murcia in Spain, as well as University of New Hampshire. He serves on the editorial board of Adaptation, Shakespeare Quarterly, and Shakespeare, and he is a past trustee of the Shakespeare Association of America. He has been the recipient of fellowships at the Folger Shakespeare Library and the New Hampshire Center for the Humanities. In 2009, he received the Gary Lindbergh Award, the University of New Hampshire's highest recognition for distinction in teaching and scholarship in the liberal arts. For 2016 and 17, he served as the Fulbright Global Shakespeare Center Distinguished Chair at Queen Mary University of London and the University of Warwick. In 2018 and 19, he served as a long-term research fellow at the Folger Shakespeare Library. Professor Lanier is widely recognized as a pioneer in the study of modern appropriations of Shakespeare in all media. His book, Shakespeare and Modern Popular Culture, published by Oxford University Press, established the basic parameters of one of the liveliest fields in Shakespeare studies today. He followed up this work with an annotated catalogue of more than 900 Shakespeare spin-off films for Shakespeare After Shakespeare, edited by Richard Burt, a series of essays on Shakespearean appropriations of specific plays for the source books Shakespeare editions, and contributions to the Cambridge World Shakespeare Encyclopedia. He has published widely on Renaissance authors, as well as on adaptation of Shakespeare worldwide in more than 50 articles in journals and collections, and he has recently completed 2 books, an edition of Timon of Athens for the new Kittredge series and The Merchant of Venice for the Arden language and writing series. He is currently at work on 2 book projects, a study of the adaptation of Othello to the screen worldwide, and a book on reparative Shakespeare productions of Shakespeare addressed to the traumas of socially marginalized groups. On behalf of Inspirare Arts Foundation and Osmania University Center for International Programs, I again extend a very warm and hearty welcome to our respected speaker, Professor Douglas Lanier. It is now all over to you, Professor Lanier, for conducting the plenary. Thank you very much.
Hello, my name is Douglas Lanier of the University of New Hampshire, and it's my great pleasure to talk to you today about Shakespeare and COVID, performance in a pandemic. In David Brenn's 1985 novel, The Postman, the nomadic protagonist Gordon wanders through a post-war dystopian United States. What is left of the nation is now a collection of disconnected rural communities, living out a hard-scrabble existence and now threatened by the rise of a neo-fascist militia that has taken root in the absence of society. To scrounge meals, Gordon performs scenes from Shakespeare, specifically Macbeth, providing his audiences with entertainment and, more importantly, a link to their past, a slender thread of cultural continuity. Gordon is no idealist, at least not at first. He just wants a bite and a bed in exchange for a play. But in the course of the novel, his faith in the power of community building after disaster grows into political activism as he seeks to rebuild fallen cultural institutions, most notably the Postal Service. At first, just another act for a meal, Gordon pretends to be a postman, but slowly his improvised act takes on a kind of reality, a means by which the isolated communities of the broken United States might reimagine themselves as a nation. Writing 30 years later, Emily St. John Mandel takes up the same idea of performing Shakespeare in the grim aftermath of a global apocalypse. In her novel, Station 11, that apocalypse is a pandemic of what is called the Georgia flu that kills most of the world's population and leaves civilization devastated. The main character, Kirsten, wanders with a troupe of itinerant performers called the Traveling Symphony, trading Shakespeare performances and musical concerts for food and shelter. Mandel's vision of the value of the company's performances is far less sanguine than Blynn's in The Postman. Mandel signals her pessimism in the novel's opening scene, in which, before the pandemic, Kirsten's idol, an elderly actor called Arthur, is performing King Lear and falls dead of a heart attack mid-performance, the harbinger of many deaths to come. Arthur's death is hardly redemptive. After the pandemic, Kirsten searches for information about Arthur's past in the dystopian detritus. It's revealing of Mandel's skepticism about the cultural legacy that Arthur represents, Shakespeare and the theater, that all Kirsten finds is evidence of Arthur's character flaws, especially his sense of privilege. I start with these two novels for two reasons. First, both books raise the topic I want to address today, performances of Shakespeare in this, our own year of pandemic dystopia. How does one perform Shakespeare live under these circumstances? Why would one even want to do so? What could such performances hope to accomplish? And how, if at all, might these kinds of performances, cobbled together in the midst of COVID, influence the future of Shakespeare on stage after this plague year has passed? Bryn and Mandel invite us to imagine Shakespeare being performed even after a complete social collapse. And so we're starting the process of imagining a post-COVID cultural world. Now is a good time to assess how and how well Shakespeare survived a year of lockdown and social distancing. Secondly, these two novels envision the power of Shakespeare in dystopia quite differently. The 30 years that separates The Postman from Station 11 marks a waning of faith in Shakespeare as an icon of cultural continuity or shared meaning. The skepticism Mandel evokes is in the ascendant, and for good reason. The past half century of criticism has shown how Shakespeare has too often been used in the service of heteronormative, racial, and colonial oppression that we've been right to challenge. In my remarks here, then, I will note how Shakespeare performance in our COVID year has reckoned with that corrosive social legacy. That said, however, I'll be taking what some of you may think is a strangely upbeat assessment of Shakespeare performance in the shadow of COVID. The larger frame for my analysis is indebted to Eve Kosofsky Sedgwick. In her late work, she discusses frankly the limitations of academic critique, and she sets against it what she calls reparative reading. Reparative criticism is interested in the uses of text to address and perhaps partly to ameliorate the traumas suffered by marginalized, oppressed, or stigmatized social groups. My current research concerns what I call reparative Shakespeare, that is, the ways in which Shakespeare has been used to redress, always partially and problematically, the psychic injuries suffered by prisoners, refugees, veterans, queer youth, the homeless, the elderly, the physically or mentally disadvantaged, and the racially or economically marginalized. COVID Shakespeare, I want to observe, has sought to have something of that reparative function for its audiences. As I discuss the examples that follow, I want to keep a sympathetic eye on their reparative ambitions and potential, even as I will also engage in a bit of traditional academic critique of my own. But first, a few words about COVID and the theater. There needs no ghost to come from the grave to tell you that the pandemic has utterly devastated the stage community, and not only because of tragic losses among actors to the virus. Theater companies were already under financial pressure from competing media and struggling to cope with dwindling art subsidies. The sudden inability to perform live before audiences because of distancing restrictions and the extension of those restrictions for over a year has been nothing short of catastrophic for the performing arts. In the United States, for example, where government support is meager in the best of times, COVID has rung the death knell of many stage companies. Estimates are that as many as half of state Shakespeare theaters and festivals are now permanently closed even after the pandemic passes. It's important, too, to measure this loss in more than merely economic terms. Lost, too, in this COVID year has been contact between performers and audiences and spectators with one another at a time where we have most suffered the effects of isolation, vulnerability, and grief. Contemporary theater has made its hallmark its very liveness. It is stressed how performers and spectators, present to each other in a single space and time, constitute a particularly intense form of communal solidarity, an experience not offered elsewhere in an age of digital disembodied media. It's that very experience, the potentially reparative and politically progressive experience of heightened liveness to each other, that COVID has made impossible. And because it has driven so many theatrical companies to ruin, COVID may continue to have effects upon the theater for years to come. Indeed, the pandemic we've all just lived through will figure as a moment of profound rupture in the history of 21st century stage performance. My interest, however, is in what interests the writers of dystopia, the ways in which cultural legacies manage to hang on through disasters and beyond, sometimes in new forms, sometimes in reclaimed or repurposed forms from the past. Certainly, dystopia involves the loss of civilization, but it also involves the survival of civilization or some piece of it through acts of improvisation, experiment, ingenuity, and reinvention. The performances I will highlight here often partake of these DIY qualities. while at the same time they register the darker emotions that COVID has conjured up. Our sudden experience of the fragility of society and of our own bodily vulnerability, the angst of isolation and the longing for a feeling of community, the desire for a means of expressing powerfully feelings of sadness, rage, fear, loss, solace, and hope, and a means for reflecting upon the meaning of this, our year of living precariously, and the opportunity it may afford to remake ourselves on the other side of the pandemic. My topic is Shakespeare performance during the pandemic, but by focusing on Shakespeare, I don't want to leave unacknowledged the theatrical work by contemporary writers during this period, work that has been exceptionally creative and vital. Nor do I wish to imply that Shakespeare has been a privileged vehicle for COVID era performance because of his putative universalism. In the past year, what Shakespeare provided actors is a way of reasserting the cultural potency of theater in the face of dire circumstances. Shakespeare offered players a familiar, authoritative, malleable property capable of speaking even to this dystopian moment, a property without the burden of copyright. Shakespeare did what he so often does at moments of media revolution. He provides an instant imprimatur for new modes of performance. These new modes of Shakespearean performance, all dependent upon new media, aimed to create a makeshift substitute for the kind of presence that theatrical performance can provide. What they end up creating is a simulacrum of theatrical liveness and presence that, simulacrum though it may be, has kept the flame of live stage performance burning, albeit dimly. One of the first COVID Shakespeare's to appear after the March 2020 lockdown were performances of individual Shakespeare sonnets. The most notable was the A Sonnet a Day postings by the actor Patrick Stewart, bringing his pop cultural cachet as Jean-Luc Picard, the Shakespeare-loving Star Trek captain. Stewart has aimed to read a single sonnet per day, each released on Twitter. In his first posting, Stewart explains the rationale behind the project. When I was a child in the 1940s, my mother would cut up slices of fruit for me. There wasn't much. And as she put it in front of me, she would say, "An apple a day keeps the doctor away." How about a sonnet a day keeps the doctor away? So here we go. Sonnet 1. Treating the pandemic as a return to wartime austerity, Stewart presents Shakespeare's words as healing, part of a folk medical regimen and a vicarious return to the pleasures of maternal care. His postings are strikingly intimate. The performances suggest we're getting access to the private man in his own private spaces, with his own pets, and tidbits about his schedule intermingled. And Stewart is no completist. At several moments in the series, he refuses to recite a sonnet because he tells us he finds it distasteful or even offensive. The A Sonnet a Day project displays many of the characteristics of COVID era Shakespeare performance. It takes advantage of social media, YouTube, Facebook, Zoom, Twitter, for distribution to a potentially worldwide audience. These performances foreground their do-it-yourself quality, since they cost very little to produce and demand very little technical expertise, All you need is an iPhone or laptop, some basic software skills, and a social media account. These performances, too, convey a sense of intimacy with their audiences, with their relentless close-ups and direct address to the viewer, and our visual access to the domestic spaces of the speakers. Because of the nature of the medium, they privilege the voice and the face over the body. And so they stress the Shakespearean text over action and mise en scène. Others were quick to follow Stuart's example, producing sonnet series of their own. The Royal Shakespeare Company began producing its Sonnets in Solitude series in May 2020, featuring present and former members of the company reciting sonnets from home. Some of the performances highlight the sonnet's connection to themes of desire, abandonment, isolation, and death, something that Stuart typically steers away from. The YouTube collective, The Show Must Go Online, has recently begun its own sonnet series, taking the thematic approach of the RSC one step further. Its series features actors in spaces that provide a lightly fictionalized frame for the sonnet, pushing the poetry in the direction of a short dramatic monologue. In parallel with Stuart's therapeutic reading of sonnets are various series of Zoom performances of complete Shakespeare plays. Within days of the initial March 2020 lockdown, there appeared the Shakespeare Happy Hours series, created by two theater companies. The Seven Stages Shakespeare Company of Portsmouth, New Hampshire, where this video comes to you from, and the Rude Grooms Company of Queens, New York. At first improvised as one-off Shakespeare performances on Zoom, the project grew over the next 5 months into performances involving actors from all around the United States and abroad, and eventually it encompassed the entire Shakespeare canon, along with a smattering of other early modern English plays. The Shakespeare Happy Hours series provided an early model for myriad other Zoom performances of Shakespeare over the following year. The Zoom format allowed for something akin to a public table read or a staged reading, with a digital pass the hat in the form of pleas for donations. Over the course of the series, the productions experimented with ways of overcoming the limitations of the Zoom medium. As we know, Zoom projects individual talking heads in little boxes isolated from one another, making it difficult for us to imagine the actors are occupying the same fictional space, particularly so when the actors are speaking from their own personal bedrooms or living rooms. As the series progressed, the actors began to use Zoom's capability to create virtual backgrounds, creating a shared visual space for the characters that enhanced the sense of dramatic illusion and, in the process, established a mood or a time frame. The Creation Theater April 2020 Zoom production of The Tempest took this development a step further. In its innovative production, all the scenes were filmed before virtual backgrounds, placing the action on a cruise ship, an island, and a shabby cabin that stood for Caliban's cave. Clever choreography allowed, for example, Trinculo's bottle to seem to pass from his frame to Caliban's frame, or for Ferdinand and Miranda to share a kiss across Zoom boxes, as you can sort of see in this slide. The production was also notable for its portrayal of Prospero, who was presented as a sinister techno wizard in a Steve Jobs turtleneck, directing the action from a lair filled with television monitors, the very incarnation of the surveillance economy. Interestingly enough, the production intercut the play's action with moments where we in the virtual audience flashed on screen as we were called to help Ariel accomplish his various magical tasks. That is to say, the play highlighted both the sinister and the reparative capabilities of the medium. About the same time as Shakespeare Happy Hours was taking shape, in the UK, there developed a second major Zoom Shakespeare series, the Show Must Go Online, created by actor-director Rob Miles, who you see here, starting in March of 2020. Like Shakespeare Happy Hours, the Show Must Go Online would eventually produce the entirety of the Shakespeare canon in live Zoom performances. But Rob Miles' approach was rather different. His virtual company consisted of actors drawn from a variety of countries and backgrounds, brought together into a rotating collective over Zoom. And over time, the Show Must Go Online's participants became more ethnically diverse, and the productions featured more and more interesting experiments with casting, particularly with gender reversal. It's not clear whether this diversification of casting was encouraged by the way in which the Zoom medium reduces our focus on the body, or by the attention to issues raised by the Black Lives Matter movement in the summer of 2020, or perhaps some combination of the both. But what is clear is that from the start, Miles intended the project to be international in casting and audience. His opener to his shows, good morning, good afternoon, and good evening, wherever you are in the world, and welcome to the Show Must Go Online, underlines his intention that his YouTube productions have an international scope. Interestingly, Miles's productions did not involve strong shared production concepts like that of the Shakespeare Happy Hours or the Creation Theater. Some of the actors wore street clothes, others performed with makeshift props and costumes, and all performed against real backgrounds of their homes or offices. Even so, the Show Must Go Online tended to be more vocally accomplished than other Shakespeare Zoom performances, and they were pointedly full text. The productions involved rehearsals to which online patrons could get limited access, and over time they became more and more technically polished with bespoke music and some limited special effects. Of interest then is the growing tension between the desire to create a production that offers the intimacy of Zooming and a production that offers the gloss of professional stage performance. Of special interest among these Zoom productions is the Sofa Shakespeare series, the brainchild of San Diego actor Julie Giosetti. Giosetti's ingenious approach is deceptively simple. Assign to a random assortment of actors, primarily amateurs, 1-minute segments of Shakespeare's plays to perform in any fashion they like, the only stricture being that they must recite the Shakespeare text as written. Giosetti then edits these recorded clips together into a full-length production she then posts on YouTube and Facebook. This is, in effect, crowdsourced performance, where variations and the DIY makeshift quality of individual contributions are precisely the point. Here's the trailer for the Sofa Shakespeare production of Romeo and Juliet, which gives you something of a taste.
Then banishment is death mistermed, calling death, banishment. Thou cuts my head off with a golden axe, and smiles upon the stroke that murders me.
Where civil blood makes civil hands unclean.
I in a camera.
Rosie, quiet!
Rebellious subjects, enemies to peace.
Shot through the ear with a muzzle!
Es war auf Lucentius Hochzeit.
El pobre Mercucio.
Is it unlike that I so early wake you up with loathsome smells and shrieks like mandrakes?
The brightness of her cheek would shame those stars as daylight doth a lamp.
What noise is this? Give me my longsword! How?
Ooh! Oh, true apothecary. My drugs are quick.
Come with me, and we shall make quick work.
Out upon you!
For now, these hot days is the mad blood stirring.
What emerges from this approach is a communal creative enterprise, a testament to the performer's inventiveness in bringing Shakespeare to life using what means they have to hand. Some of the best individual clips explore common ground between the assigned passages and the experience of lockdown. Sofa Shakespeare bears a family resemblance to the tabletop Shakespeare project pioneered by the British experimental theater group Forced Entertainment. The tabletop Shakespeare series involved telling the tales of Shakespeare's plays using common household items, a salt shaker, a beer bottle, to represent the characters. Though this was originally conceptualized in 2015, Tabletop's productions of the entire Shakespeare canon were recorded during the lockdown and have been posted on YouTube. As Force Entertainment's artistic director, Tim Etchells, explains it, the intent is to domesticate Shakespeare without losing the compelling power of his narrative, to reduce the distance between the epic, antiquated nature of Shakespeare's tales and the world of mundane domestic objects and spaces where we live so much of our lives. This, too, is the effect of Sofa Shakespeare. One watches a Sofa Shakespeare production on two tracks at once. On the one hand, there's a kaleidoscopic production of Shakespeare with the text holding the ever-changing performances style together into a whole. And on the other hand is the inventiveness and resilience of the performers, making art amidst difficult circumstances, a sort of poor Shakespearean theater. Even though some of the performances are intentionally comic, the overall effect is not parodic so much as unexpectedly earnest and joyful, a celebration of Shakespeare as a shared cultural space. Interestingly, Sofa Shakespeare has had international reach in its participants. The project and several of its Indian participants were covered in the Indian press in 2020. And I might add that I have assigned Sofa Shakespeare projects to my classes during this past COVID years, and students report to me that they've learned much about the minutiae of interpreting and performing the Shakespeare's text. I recommend them highly. Most of the productions I've mentioned so far involve amateur or quasi-professional companies, many of which exist only on the internet. For the most part, professional theater companies were slow during the pandemic to take advantage of the opportunities digital performance of Shakespeare might afford. This partly springs from the challenge of monetizing online productions And partly it springs from the long-standing reticence about the digital medium from Shakespeare companies who want to privilege live face-to-face performance. As the year wore on, however, this reticence began to soften, and professional companies began to release their performance recordings online, at first for free, in order to maintain the public's taste for the stage, and later in the form of various pay-for-view schemes. This was, for example, the case with Shakespeare's Globe and the National Theatre in London, the Stratford Festival in Ontario, Blackfriars Theatre in Virginia, and the Ashland Festival in Oregon. One effect of COVID then was to erode the unwillingness of professional companies to make their catalog of recordings available to the public. It remains to be seen whether this access will be temporary or permanent. In any case, alongside this avalanche of pre-COVID, pre-recorded material has been a ramping up of online educational materials produced by professional companies. Many of them now produce regular Zoom chats with actors, directors, and academics. Just to name a few, there is the Shakespeare Hour Live, produced by the Shakespeare Theatre in Washington, D.C. The Public Shakespeare Initiative series, produced by the Public Theater in New York City, and the Talking Back series, produced by the Ashland Festival. These series address a much wider range of topics than companies have typically produced before, in part because they were under pressure to produce regular content. Especially notable is that these series took up questions of diversity and social justice with more frequency and urgency than ever before. And those conversations bore fruit in several interesting online productions. In the summer of 2020, the Public Theater in New York staged a radio play version of Richard II with an all-Black cast that directly engaged with the Black Lives Matters movement. This very month, the Public staged a bilingual radio adaptation of Romeo and Juliet that brought together Latinx and Black actors and addressed American ethnic tension. When the pandemic first hit, a few of the smaller professional companies were quick to produce new online content. One of the most interesting of these was the Barn Theater's Barred from the Barn series, produced from April to October 2020. Actors from the Barn Theater created 3 series of short films for YouTube, centered around individual Shakespeare monologues so that they could comply with lockdown restrictions. What makes these shorts distinctive is that they're all set in the dystopian present of the pandemic, and the monologues are presented so that they address our collective state of mind during this time. Titus Andronicus, for example, becomes a suburbanite driven mad by COVID rage. Nell Quickly's tale of Falstaff's death is transformed into a health worker's sad account of a COVID patient's demise. Prospero's epilogue to The Tempest serves as a melancholy voiceover as an actor walks through an empty theater and looks out over the empty stalls. Here is how the Bard from the Barn series handled Henry's heroic "once more into the breach" oration from Henry V.
Once more unto the breach, dear friends, once more. In peace, there's nothing so becomes a man as modest stillness and humility. But when the blast of war blows in our ears, then imitate the action of the tiger. Stiffen the sinews, summon up the blood. Disguise fair nature with hard-favored rage. Now, set the teeth and stretch the nostrils wide. Hold hard the breath and bend up every spirit to his full height. On, you noblest English. Dishonor not your mothers. Now attest that those whom you called fathers did beget you. Be copy now to men of grosser blood, and teach them how to war. And you, good yeoman, whose limbs were made in England, show us here the mettle of your pasture. Let us swear that you are worth your breeding, which I doubt not. For there is none of you so mean and base that hath not noble lustre in your eyes. I see you stand like greyhounds in the slips, straining upon the start. The game's afoot. Follow your spirit, and upon this charge, cry God for Harry, England, and St. George!
This clip now reads mostly ironically, but if we think back to the earliest days of the pandemic when going to the grocery seemed potentially life-threatening, this short records poignantly the weary act of summoning up the blood to get the shopping done. The ways in which the Barn Theatres series made Shakespeare's words immediately relevant to the pandemic were ingenious and often brilliant. A wonderful example of using Shakespeare to speak to and of our shared condition under lockdown. A very different approach to Shakespearean monologues was taken by the Perchance Theatre of Newfoundland and Labrador, Canada, in its Power of One series. Perchance's innovation was to film monologues by company members in picturesque outdoor locales throughout Eastern Canada. A handful of the shorts resonate with the natural setting and present circumstances, most notably Joan Dicker's recitation of The Wind and the Rain from Twelfth Night in Dicker's native Inuit language. But for the most part, the Shakespeare speeches are conceived of as a means for temporary escape from the pandemic, rather than a confrontation with its grim realities. And those speeches are thereby coupled with drone shots of lovely natural landscapes into which the spectator is whisked. It's telling, for example, that after Caliban complains of Prospero's mistreatment and of the noises of the island, we see him swimming away in a majestic shot of Woody Point, Newfoundland. The slogan of the project, "Be patient, for the world is broad and wide," from Romeo and Juliet, speaks to how this series sees both Shakespeare's words and the promise of natural splendor as a way of making the lockdown bearable. My final example, an online-only performance simply called Dream, was produced by the Royal Shakespeare Company and closed just this past weekend. Dream extends the RSC's experiments with motion capture technology, which it first pioneered with its 2016 production of The Tempest, starring Simon Russell Beale. In that live stage performance, Mark Quartley's Ariel was mirrored by a real-time digital avatar who produced the character's many magical effects. The current production, Dream, took that idea considerably further. The action of the play takes place within a fantastical forest environment created by the Unreal game engine, the software behind such games as Fortnite and Hellblade, and the special effects in Westworld and The Mandalorian. All the actors were fitted with motion capture suits, and their performances dictate the movements of the characters within the magical virtual forest. In addition, the online audience has limited abilities to enter the fantasy world in the form of a firefly controlled by the user's mouse. The result is a hybrid of animated film, interactive video game, and most importantly, live performance. Indeed, Dream goes to some length to remind us of the actors behind the virtual avatars. The production begins with E.M. Williams, seen here, the actor playing Puck, dressed in her motion capture suit and addressing the viewer directly as herself. It closes pardon me. It closes with us seeing the studio where the virtual production is made, all of the characters in their tech gear and pandemic masks. This bearing of the technological device is meant to assure us that we are not seeing some pre-recorded film, but live acting, something that it's easy to forget once we enter the virtual environment. In many ways, Dream heightens rather than extinguishes the tensions between the liveness of theater, the scripted interactivity of video games, and the pre-recorded fixity of cinematic special effects. The risk is of a gee whiz response to the utterly dazzling, immersive tech rather than attention to the actor's skills or to the story. That risk is considerable since the reviews all dwelt almost exclusively on the techno wizardry. That's a shame, for Dream tells an interesting, if simple, story. The production derives from Shakespeare's A Midsummer Night's Dream and to a lesser extent from The Tempest, though it's not faithful to either of Shakespeare's narratives, though the dialogue is pure Shakespearean pastiche. Puck, the fairy protagonist, meanders through the magical nighttime wood that is heavily reminiscent of the wood in the film Avatar. In his ambles, he encounters fairy characters from Shakespeare's plays, Oberon, Moth, Mustard Seed, and the ominous Cobweb. All of these creatures, Puck included, have an elemental quality about them. Puck's body is formed of animated stones, as you can see in the slide. Oberon is a walking bundle of twigs and branches. Moth is a flock of shimmering wings, and Cobweb is a giant eyeball wedged in the hollow of a tree, a figure surrounded by cobweb eyelashes. Puck's initial engagement with these creatures is lighthearted and charming as he dances and flits from space to lovely space in the forest. Soon a storm brews, however, and seeking shelter, Puck becomes trapped in the tree with the frightening figure of Cobweb. Once the tempest passes, Puck emerges from his hiding place to discover a dystopian landscape, the lush vegetation from his earlier idyll utterly gone, ravaged by the storm. Even so, as Puck wanders through this desolate terrain, he happens upon a small flower and a single fluttering moth, signs of survival and of life reemerging. After recognizing these as reincarnations of his friends, he then looks toward the dawning sky and the stones that form his body fall to the ground. Now, it's tempting to see the plot of Dream as playing out Titania's speech about the fairy's destruction of nature from Act 2, Scene 1. And so to see the piece as a cautionary fable about environmental destruction, illustrated with the familiar iconography of dystopia. But I think a better interpretive horizon for this production might be our collective experience of the COVID epidemic. The state of innocence that preceded the disease, the sudden storm that's divided us from our friends, the sense of entrapment inside close quarters as the plague raged outside, the feeling of surveillance and claustrophobia during lockdown, the sense of bittersweet release and faint hope after the devastation has passed. The dark Athenian wood of A Midsummer Night's Dream becomes, in this scenario, the dark mindscape of those of us who've weathered COVID, expressing our movement from naive complacency about our relations to others and nature, through isolation and fear, to tentative new beginnings as we emerge from lockdown and contemplate a post-pandemic world. Dream, its creators acknowledge, is a theatrical experiment born of necessity, as are most of the improvised performances I've surveyed in this talk. Dream freely adapts Shakespeare to address the communal trauma of COVID, and it seeks with its liveness to give the audience a digital substitute for the shared experience of watching a stage performance. In the latter case, I would argue, it's a failed if noble experiment, and it highlights the difficulty faced by all the Shakespearean performances of this period, how to create online an experience of reparative communality, of presentness to one another, of a common imaginative enterprise. For me, the most moving of these Shakespeare performances during COVID took the form not of high tech, but of poor theater, productions in which the improvisatory ingenuity of the performers was most plainly in view in their makeshift costumes and cluttered bedroom backgrounds. The pandemic has forced theater practitioners to experiment and improvise, to repurpose older performance modes and media, to revisit the tension between live stage performance and performance in new media, to reflect upon the theater's obligation to social justice, even in the middle of institutional and financial crisis, and to reconceive of its relationships with its audiences and the purpose of playing. In short, to think about how to carry on in disaster and beyond. Whether these experiments and new models for performing Shakespeare will outlive our COVID year is not yet certain. But amidst a year of so much loss and psychological pain, these productions testify, I think, to Shakespeare's capacity to speak our need for solace, resilience, and hope. Thank you so much for the invitation to speak, and best wishes for the conference.